Yeah, yeah.
Well, today our theme is being in the presence of Jesus. And I love this little picture. I love this picture. It just feels like a nice warm day and just kind of being with Jesus in a special way. And one of the things that got me to thinking about this, in case anybody hasn't noticed, our world right now is rather chaotic. And I'm not sure it's any different than it's ever been before. But I think the media helps us know it more often and more thoroughly. Um, that even listening to David Muir begin the news, he has an anxious tone to his voice that if you're not careful, you can become anxious.
Okay.
And people are very anxious. And I think the new American pastime is not baseball anymore, it's outrage. Every day, we find a new thing to be outraged by. Where do we go to feel safe? To me, that's a huge question. And so I got to thinking about this as a Benedictine. And Saint Benedict in the 500s left Rome because he got tired of looking at the materialism and corruption. He felt that, um, and Roman Empire was literally disintegrating. So libraries were being ransacked. The tribes from the north were invading. Everything was chaotic. And so he left and went to a cave. And this is Subiaco. I had the privilege of being there. And this is a monastery that's been built on the site of the cave that he went to for 3 years just to feel safe and to feel quiet, to pray, and to discern his future.
Who was it again?
Saint Benedict.
Okay.
And sorry.
We can still see.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is the actual cave. Today, I went on a tour with the Benedictines, and this is the cave where he lived and prayed. And monks from a local monastery would lower food in a basket. That's why it shows that basket in there. And that's how he lived. And then ravens supposedly brought him food also. During the pandemic, I called my apartment Subiaco because I couldn't go anywhere and I had groceries delivered. I felt like I was in my own little cave and it felt good. It just felt good and it felt safe and it felt um, just in the presence of God. I never got bored, which I was surprised at because I tend to can get bored. But there's a scripture verse from the Last Supper. Because really what we're looking for is a quest for home. Because home for most people, not everybody, is a place of security and peace and a place to relax. And there's this verse in the King James in particular from the Last Supper. And it says, now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. And Brennan Manning has a whole chapter on this verse in which he talks about listening to the heartbeat of the rabbi. Now, some people get really nervous about this verse, and because they were reclining at table, which means that John, who is the one Jesus loved, has reclined over and his head is resting on the chest of Jesus where he can hear them. And some people get really awkward with that. Is that an awkward or wow? Yeah. And so we get this image of Jesus, of John leaning over and resting his head on the chest of it's snuggling with Jesus, which I think is a very cool concept.
Yeah.
You know, and God sees us through our core. There is nothing about us that God doesn't see, which allows us to be embraced because there's nothing to hide. He knows who we are. Well, Delacroix did this painting of Mark chapter 4 of Christ asleep during the tempest. And I did the Deacon Nina thing and printed these out.
Thank you.
And you can see it, Karen, on the screen. And in this painting, you see Jesus asleep in the front of the boat. But notice right in front of him, Delacroix takes a little poetic license. And there's John sleeping again, snuggled up with Jesus. Now, the text in Mark doesn't say that, but Delacroix has picked up on that theme of the intimacy with Jesus, allowing us. Now, this whole scripture text came to light for me. My wife had been diagnosed with leukemia. I had 2 preschoolers. My life was falling apart. And one night, in the middle of the night, I just couldn't sleep. I mean, I was serving a new congregation of 2,000 people, and I just couldn't sleep. So I was up reading scripture and ran across this. And in Sunday school, I learned, that the miracle was Jesus calming the storm. But to me that night, I recognized the miracle. Jesus is asleep in the middle of that chaos. He has such peace with the Father. So one of my prayers for the last 40 years has been, Jesus, let me sleep in the front of the boat. And then I found this Delacroix painting. And I sometimes use this painting for prayer and visualize myself where John is. And then I picked up on that whole thing from Brennan Manning of listening to the heart of the rabbi. Because, Manning says this, wise men and women have long held that happiness lies in being yourself without inhibitions. Let the great rabbi hold you in silently against his heart. Let the rabbi hold you silently against his heart. That for me has become a very powerful image in prayer. And so as we work with that, I also like to visualize just having my head resting on his lap and being at peace.
Hi.
And just cuddling, So here's a statue that was created based on that scripture verse from the Last Supper. Now, I don't like this sculpture that well because, for one thing, it looks very stiff. And I don't like it because if they're really doing the text, they would be reclining. And I just think this should capture that. But what I'd like to do now is have us visualize either the painting or this sculpture, or have your eyes closed, because we're going to listen to the heartbeat. And for me, it is the heartbeat of the rabbi. And so just go ahead and we're going to do this for 3 or 4 minutes. Here, if it works, here we go. invite you to come back where we are. And so, what was that like? Yeah, there's a thing called the Jesus prayer that comes out of Russia. And I don't have the exact words with me, but you pray it in the rhythm of your heart and in the rhythm of your breathing. And I still can't do it. Every time I do this, I end up practically hyperventilating, trying to get my breathing to match the breathing of the rhythm of the prayer. But the consciousness of it really helps me move into the Jesus prayer. Not everybody has the recording of a heartbeat, although you can go on YouTube and get one. That's where I got this one. But what would be like for you to rest in the presence? What would be a practice that would help you do that? And you can do it anywhere. I used to run a camp for high school kids down in Iowa, and this was the whole week was on spiritual practices, and we did a contemplative bike ride. 30 teenagers had to be silent for 15 minutes on the bike ride through the woods, because I told them, listen for sounds that you normally wouldn't think about. And as we were processing at the end, oh my goodness, they came up with sounds that I had heard, but I was amazed that they heard them, being mindful of it.
Yeah.
And I know of one woman who has 3 children who tries to have quiet time. So here's what she does. She sits in her favorite chair and she pulls a blanket over her head and is a symbol to the kids. Unless you're bleeding, leave me alone. And if you're in this room, be quiet. And for her, that works.
Blanket over the head.
The first time I went on the silent retreat, I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown thinking about it, because I'm not a silent person. And by the end of the weekend, I was hooked. There's something about the silence, but because when you're in the silence, you can hear the heartbeat, you can hear the frogs, you can hear, and so anyway, this is an invitation to rest in the presence of Jesus, and our time is up. Church is starting.